This is what 2 10-minute walks per day can do to your brain. Okay, we have to start with the very basic study. This was a study that was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology back in the 1980s. And it's the old paradoxical thing of, okay, you can eat a candy bar for energy or you can go for a walk. They literally had them do this. One group ate a candy bar, one group went for a walk. And what they simply found is that people that went for a walk ended up having more energy and less tension, and people that ate the candy bar had a little bit more energy for like a half an hour to an hour, and then after that, ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, had much less energy. So just because it's fuel doesn't mean you literally get energy from it in the way that you want. Sometimes going for a walk actually gives you more energy. But we all know going for a walk is a better decision than grabbing a candy bar at this point in time. But what can it do to us? What can it do to our brain? Well, we have to remember that it's all about the glucose modulation. So there's a study that was published in Scientific Reports. It took a look at over 23,000 people, and it found that the more sugar intake they had, the higher the instance of depression and bad moods they had, and the opposite on the other end of the spectrum. And if you look at the data and you look at some other studies, you find, okay, well, it probably has to do with inflammation, probably has to do with dopamine, probably has to do with a number of these neurotransmitters that are being affected by sugar. But what we have to remember is one very simple thing. Sugar gets burned up when we move, when we walk. So going for a simple walk might be like literally the most simple thing that you can do with the most bang for the buck, because you have what is called insulin-independent glucose uptake. So what happens is the glucose that's circulating has to go somewhere, even if you're insulin resistant. So that glucose goes into the cell and gets utilized by the muscle, and ultimately your blood sugar drops. But you're thinking, well, does blood sugar really have a correlation to my mood? Yes, it does. So with this, we look at a study that was published in the journal Diabetes Care. And this was interesting because it took a look at people that were insulin-resistant type 2 diabetic. And they gave them a glucose clamp. They clamped them at over 200 milligrams per deciliter of glucose. So basically clamped them so they remained very high glucose, or clamped them at what's called, or at 81, so a lower, more stable glucose homeostasis. Well, they found that when subjects had high glucose, their memory, their attention, and their mood all went down immediately. So it's not one of these things where, oh, I just consumed too much sugar, so I have a bad mood. No, if your glucose is high, it immediately can impact your mood, immediately can affect your attention span, and immediately affect your memory. So the impact on the brain is unreal. What's wild is that just going for a walk for 10 minutes can soak up that glucose, even if you're insulin resistant, thereby reducing that negative impact, especially on the hippocampal region of the brain, which affects memory. So with that, we have to look at another study that looked at healthy individuals, because this one study is cool, but it was mainly looking at diabetics. Not everyone's diabetic. This study found that lower HbA1c, which looks more like over the course of 90 days, led to better, or was correlated with better memory, again, better attention, and ultimately better mood. But what they found that was even more wild was that there was an association with the hippocampal volume, suggesting that the more sugar that we consume, the higher the HbA1c, the more atrophied the brain gets. One of the fastest ways that you can improve your HbA1c is going for a walk after you eat. Now, this has been chronicled across lots of bodies of research that exercise is probably the biggest modulator of our glucose levels. I could say all I want about food and nutrition, about little hacks here and there, but simply moving your body is the best way, because we're not having to worry about manipulating anything at the pancreatic level. We're not trying to restore beta cell function. We're not trying to restore alpha cell function. In other words, we're not trying to fix the deeply rooted problem. We're working on the fringes by allowing the body to soak up the glucose so that it can actually get to work on repairing. If you soak up the glucose, things start to get better. And after this video, I put a link down below to check out my friend's book. Okay, it's called The Longevity Nutrient, and it's written by Dr. Stephanie Venn Watson and Eric Venn Watson. And it is a really solid book that talks about various deficiencies that contribute to poorer longevity, poorer health span, but it's a really fascinating book. And I also put a link down below for their interesting product that they created in partnership with the Navy, which is quite interesting, called Fatty 15, that helps out cellular integrity. So essentially it makes it so that a cell doesn't become super rigid, but also doesn't become so flexible that
it's susceptible to oxidative stress. It's hard to describe in like a quick 15, 20 seconds, but I'd recommend that you check out that book. So that book is down below. I linked to it down below in the top line of the description, and I also linked to Fatty 15, which is a C15 replacement supplement for one of the worst deficiencies that we're seeing in the world right now, and the first clinical deficiency discovered in 75 years. So anyhow, that link down below also gets you a discount on the product, but it's all down below in the top line of the description.
The other thing we have to look at is the simple craving side of things. Okay, so if we look at that first study I talked about, the candy bar thing, it was interesting because subjects had sort of this fork in the road. They could grab a candy bar or they could go for a walk. The other thing we have to remember is simple Pavlovian response. If we choose going for a walk or choose doing push-ups or choose doing some squats instead of opting for that candy bar, although it's the unattractive option at first, eventually, over a course of a couple of months, it becomes what the brain is looking for reward. Remember that the brain responds to sugar outside of our consciousness. There's a study published in Neuroscience that found that when we consume sugar, it affects the dopaminergic pathway. It affects dopamine receptors. And eventually, we get such a reward from sugar, we have no control. We just go for it because it makes us feel a certain way. And eventually, those dopamine receptors become desensitized. So we need more and more and more sugar, again, somewhat unconsciously, just to feel normal. It's almost like if you get addicted to a drug, you need to do more and more of that drug to feel normal. And eventually, you feel abnormal without the drug present. And we get to be that way with sugar. Now, the way that we can combat this, once again, if we can actually let the sugar be used. For one, if we consume carbs, use the sugar, then it doesn't have a chance to impact the dopamine receptors as much because it's actually being translated into fuel. And I know that there's some research being done in this category where if fuel is immediately used, does it still impact the brain the same way? But additionally, you're creating a different stimulus. So if you choose to walk instead of that candy bar, that is eventually going to pacify that area of the brain that's seeking the reward. Maybe not as powerfully as sugar did, but over time, it's going to be the better option. So going for a 10-minute walk might literally be the best thing that you can do for your entire life. That one 10-minute choice that you make today can affect you 20 years from now. I'll see you tomorrow.